And now, Ms. Harris, let's see if we can have you to talk about the topic, that is slavery and the African-American heritage, by informing our audience through your books in reference to some of this information.
Okay. The first book that I've written and I would like to talk about is entitled Gloucester. And it's named after a small town in Mississippi. And my grandmother, when I was growing up, told my cousins as well as my brother about what had transpired in Gloucester. In Gloucester, where my grandmother lived, with her father and mother and her 7 sisters and brothers, there was a horrific crime that took place in that area. And it's about my great-grandfather, who was born as Willis Felix Faust in 1859. His mother was Margaret Longmire. And during my research, I had heard about them. I had no idea where I could find them. So July of 2014, I found my great-great-grandmother, who was my great-grandfather's mother. She was living at the time in Woodville, Mississippi. She was born in 1830 as a slave. I found her living with her, I'm assuming, slave master, a former slave master, and her daughter, and her the other people that were living in the house with them, who my great-grandfather was a servant to. His name was Dr. Samuel Haynes. The owner of the plantation was William Haynes, and at that time it wasn't a plantation, but the slaves, he owned about 100 slaves, were still on his property.
Sharecroppers and similar kinds of activities, doing essentially what they had done during the period of slavery, but now under freedom. And most of the attitudes and all of those things were still connected with the institution of slavery. I'm very, very familiar with that, because I think that that, in a real sense, is the heritage of a large number of us who've looked back into whatever. But go on and tell your story.
Right, and that's true. They never had the means to move off of the property, so they remained there, like you said, and worked for them as probably former slaves. And so I found him with his mom and sister when he was 11 years old in 1870. And his father, I believe, was the owner of a slave trading company, because his last name was Faust. And I found, during my research, I found a Faust and Wilson slave trading company. And I want the audience to keep the Wilson in mind, because I'm going to refer to that in a few minutes. But what happened was that, according to our oral history, Willis Faust was a foster child. And I found that difficult to believe, because I couldn't see a black male child being a foster child. So I found his mother, who was 40 at the time, and a sister who was 17. She was a Haynes, the mother was a Longmire, and Willis was a Faust. So we got 3 different names, and they were living in the Haynes house. I believe that Martha, who was Willis's mother, had her daughter by William Haynes, who was the headmaster in the house, because all 4 of them were living in the house with him. In addition to that, the sister had had a baby who was named Anthony Haynes, and the baby was about 2 months old. So they were all living on the farm as a family. According to our family history, Dr. Haynes taught Willis how to read and write. And he had the equivalent to an eighth grade education, which he was which would be highly educated for a black man at that time. Right. What happened is that this became problematic down through his life, because in 1909, he had previously acquired 38.1 acres of land under the Homestead Act. And he and his wife, Delia, her name was Delia Wilson, her slave owners were also slave traders. And they had the 7 children. And with the 7 children, they were able to acquire this land, and they farmed on the land. Well, in 1909, Willis went to a store to acquire supplies for his farm. And there are several versions of how Willis ended up in the situation he ended up, but I would tell the story, I believe, to definitely that can be documented. He went to, as I said, get the supplies. When he got there, the young lady, he gave the young lady monies for his supplies. And evidently he had an account there. And when he gave the lady her his money, instead of subtracting the money, she added the money. And he confronted her about it. And so she said, "Are you calling me a liar?" And he said, "No, I'm not calling you a liar, but numbers don't lie." So that evening when he went home, there was a mob that came to his house, told him to come outside or they would burn him and his family in the house. So he decided to come outside, and they got him and lynched him at that particular time. And so my grandmother and the rest of the family had to acquire whatever belongings they could and leave immediately. And they went to live with her, with Delia, who was Willis's wife's people, until they were able to migrate north.
Well, and of course, I think we're getting ready for our second commercial break here, Ms. Harris. But that's essentially the kind of information that we're looking for, and I think that sort of brings into focus not only what happened with your family, but what happened to a large number of families, and lynchings and violence and burnings and et cetera and et cetera. So we're going to get back. We'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.